In an office at Queen Mary University of London, the astronomer Guillaume Anglada Escudé looked at a wobble in a star's light amounting to 40 centimeters per second, slower than a person walking, and became one of the first humans to know for certain that a rocky world orbited the nearest star to our own. 4 years later, a person in a suit not yet built, breathing air not yet manufactured, steps onto the surface that wobble implied. The ground is red under a red light. Nothing sets, nothing rises. And the first thing this traveler understands, standing on the closest planet outside our solar system that a human being will ever reach, is that they do not know if anything they are looking at is real, or dangerous, or alive. The star hangs in the sky, where it has always hung, and where it will hang for the rest of this walk, because Proxima b does not spin the way Earth spins. It shows one face to its sun, always, the way the moon shows one face to us. There is no morning here, there will be no evening. Whatever this world is going to reveal, it will not reveal it in a day, because on this world there is no such thing as a day to divide the revealing into. The star itself, before any of that, is not a calm one. It flares roughly 300 times a day at millimeter wavelengths alone, each burst lasting only seconds, and its corona runs 40 times denser than the sun's. Its magnetic cycle should not exist at all, by the physics governing stars this small, and yet spots cover perhaps a fifth of its surface at any given moment. This is the world the wobble promised. It did not promise it would be gentle. There is no way to transmit that fact home in real time. The star is 4.24 light-years from the room where Anglada Escudé once read a spreadsheet of radial velocities and understood, before almost anyone else alive, that something was orbiting out there. Whatever this traveler sees in the next hour will not reach Earth for more than 4 years. Whatever conclusion they draw standing here, alone, will have to survive that silence before anyone can argue with it. So there is a rule, and it has to be stated before anything else, because it will govern everything that follows. This is not an aerial survey. It is not a satellite pass with days of data streaming down at once. It is one body, walking in one direction, at one moment, with one set of senses, and no way to ask the planet a second question if the first answer is wrong. Every stain on a rock, every shift in the wind, every light in the sky from here forward will have to be judged the way the traveler judges it, in the order the traveler encounters it, without the comfort of an answer key. Before we go further, if this is worth a few minutes of your night, a like, a comment, and a subscribe helps the channel. Now, let us take the first step. The star does not move. That is the first fact the body has to learn, because every human nervous system on Earth evolved around a sun that rises, climbs, and sets, and this sun does none of those things. It sits low and red, near one edge of the sky, roughly where it sat an hour ago, roughly where it will sit tomorrow, because Proxima b is very likely locked in synchronous rotation, the same face turned toward its star forever, the way our moon turns the same face toward us. There is no proof of this from orbit alone. It is inference from tidal mechanics, not measurement, but it is inference strong enough that almost every serious model of this planet treats it as close to certain. What that means, standing here, is that shadows do not swing. On Earth, a shadow is a clock. It shortens toward noon and lengthens toward evening, and the body reads that lengthening without being told to, the way it reads a face. Here, the shadow a boot casts falls at nearly the same angle it fell 20 minutes ago. The mind keeps waiting for the small correction that never comes. It is a wrongness too small to name and too constant to ignore. There is no wind to explain, either, Not yet. Not on a near side, where the air itself may be closer to still than any place a human body has ever stood, and the absence of that motion removes one more cue the body was quietly relying on without knowing it. The color is wrong in a second way. Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf, cooler than the sun by thousands of degrees, and the light, reaching the ground here, sits toward the red and infrared end of what a human eye can register at all. Photographers who have worked under tungsten light indoors know a pale version of this effect, the way a white wall goes faintly orange under the wrong bulb. Multiply that shift by the difference between a star at roughly 3,000 degrees and one at 5,700, and the ordinary reference points are gone. A rock that would read as grey under an Earth sky reads as something closer to rust. The pupils widen to gather more of a light that is dimmer overall than daylight, but never dims further and never brightens, because there is no dawn coming and no dusk to hurry toward. We know this world exists at all only because that same star refuses to sit still in a different way. Astronomers first confirmed the wobble behind this planet's existence by tracking tiny, regular shifts in the star's velocity, produced by the gravitational tug of an unseen planet locked into a short, fast orbit. That wobble is the entire foundation this walk is built on. No telescope has ever seen this planet cross the face of its star, because the geometry does not allow it. The transit method that later missions used to study worlds like the 7 planets circling the star, TRAPPIST-1, simply does not work here. Whatever this traveler learns will have to come from being here, not from watching light dim and brighten from 4 light-years away. There is a second consequence of that fixed light, less obvious than color and shadow, and it concerns the star itself rather than the ground beneath it. A star that never moves across the sky can still change, and this one does, constantly, in ways a traveler standing under it cannot yet distinguish from a trick of the eyes. A patch of light near the disk brightens for a moment and fades. Is that the star doing something, or is it fatigue, or refraction through a helmet visor built for a different sun? On Earth, a flicker like that would be checked against a horizon full of reference points, trees, buildings, the position of the sun an hour before. Here, there is no hour before. There is only this moment and the ambiguous brightening inside it. The temperature carries its own kind of stillness. Heat on Earth arrives and leaves on the same schedule as light, warming through the morning, peaking in the afternoon, draining away after sunset, and the body has spent its whole life calibrated to that rhythm without ever thinking about it. Here the warmth against the suit's outer layer, faint as it is, this close to the point on the globe, facing directly away from the terminator, simply persists. It does not build toward an afternoon that will never come. It does not retreat toward an evening that does not exist. A thermometer would show the same reading, now that it showed at what felt, subjectively, like an hour ago, and would show it again at what will feel like an hour from now, because on the near side of a tidally locked world, near is the only side there is. Even breathing inside the suit starts to feel unmoored from what breathing has always meant. On Earth, the rhythm of a body slows in a certain register as afternoon becomes evening, some old inheritance from a nervous system built around a setting sun, whether or not the conscious mind ever notices it happening. Here, that cue simply never fires. The body keeps behaving as if the day is still climbing toward its center, because as far as the light is concerned, it always is. What is being lost here is not information. The instruments are recording everything they were built to record: temperature and light, and the star's faint, restless brightening near its disk. What is being lost is the interpretive shortcut a human nervous system has used for its entire evolutionary history. The assumption that light changing means time passing in a particular, familiar direction. That assumption dies quickly under a sun that does not move. What replaces it, for now, is uncertainty about something as basic as how long this traveler has already been standing here, and the first understanding that the walk ahead will have to build its own sense of time from scratch, because the sky above it, fixed and red and patient, has no intention of supplying one. There is only one direction that makes sense to walk, and it is toward the place where this fixed light finally gives way to something else. Not east, not west. Those words do not apply to a world that does not turn beneath its star. The only direction with meaning here is toward the line separating the half of the planet locked in permanent day from the half locked in permanent night. And so the traveler begins walking toward that line, one boot in front of the other, with no way to know in advance how far it is or how long the crossing will take. The first change is not visual, it is underfoot. The ground near the point of the planet facing its star directly holds a texture the traveler's boots register before the eyes do, something between packed dust and fused mineral, the kind of surface that forms under light and heat that have never varied enough to weather it the way an Earth landscape weathers under a cycling sun. A few hundred meters on, the texture shifts, fractionally, toward something looser. Whether that shift means anything, whether it marks the start of a gradual transition or is simply local geology with no relationship to distance from the terminator at all, is not something that can be answered by looking at one patch of ground. It can only be answered by continuing to walk and watching whether the pattern holds. The light dims, but it dims the way a held note fades, rather than the way an event happens. On Earth, evening announces itself. The sky changes color across the span of an hour, in a sequence anyone who has watched a sunset could describe from memory. Here there is no sequence to describe, because there is no discrete evening at all, only a light that is very slightly less intense than it was at the start of the walk. So slightly that the change is impossible to confirm without checking an instrument. And even then, the instrument reports a number that means nothing without a second number taken later to compare it to. Shadows begin, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. Not because the star has moved, it has not, but because the traveler is walking around the curve of the planet toward the place where the star's angle above the horizon decreases, the way a person standing at increasing latitude on Earth would see a fixed noon sun sit lower in the sky the farther they traveled from the equator. It is the same geometry, borrowed from a different cause. On Earth, that lengthening shadow belongs to afternoon. Here, it belongs to nothing but distance. The suit registers a temperature drop long before it becomes noticeable through the fabric. A fraction of a degree at a time, a curve so shallow it could be mistaken for instrument drift if it were not so consistent in direction. Consistency is the only thing distinguishing a real trend from noise out here, because there is no second reading to check it against, no forecast from a network of weather stations, no history of what this exact stretch of ground has done before. There is only this walk, and whatever pattern reveals itself across its length. The wind changes character before it changes strength. Early in the walk, it carried almost nothing. A stillness consistent with a near side, where the atmosphere, if this planet has retained one at all, in any substantial sense, sits in rough equilibrium with a heat source that never moves. Now there is a directionality to it, faint but persistent. Air beginning to organize itself the way air always organizes itself, around any difference in temperature, pulled from where it is warmer, toward where it is cooler. If the planet has a meaningful atmosphere, and if that atmosphere behaves the way models of tidally locked worlds suggest it should, this modest breeze may be the leading edge of a much larger circulation, heat carried bodily from the permanent day side toward the permanent night side, because there is no other way for a world locked in this configuration to keep its far side from freezing solid. A gentle wind, if the traveler is reading it correctly, may be evidence of the entire planet's survival strategy. None of this arrives as spectacle. That is the part hardest to convey and most important to hold on to. There is no cliff edge marking a boundary, no wall of darkness visible from a distance the way it might appear in an illustration made for people who have never walked an unfamiliar landscape and do not know how gradual real change actually is. The terrain shifts by degrees. The light fades by degrees. The wind strengthens by degrees. 100 small measurements, each individually inconclusive, each only meaningful in relation to the 100 that came before it, and the uncertain 100 still to come. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes from this sort of walking, distinct from ordinary physical tiredness, and it has to do with attention rather than muscle. On a world with a normal day, the mind is allowed to rest for stretches, because the environment is doing some of the work of marking progress. A sunset says the day is ending, whether or not a person is paying close attention to it. Here, nothing says anything on its own. Every signal that this walk is going somewhere has to be actively gathered, compared, and held in memory against the signals gathered 10 minutes earlier, because the planet will not do that comparison for the traveler. It offers only the raw material. The pattern has to be assembled by hand, continuously, for as long as the walking continues, and that continuous assembly is its own kind of exhausting, in a way no map of this world could have predicted in advance. Twice during the walk, the traveler stops, not because anything demands a stop, but because stopping is the only way to test whether the changes noticed while moving are real or are artifacts of motion itself, the visual equivalent of hearing a ringing in silence that turns out to have been imagined. Standing still, the light does not change, the shadow does not move. The only difference between standing still here and standing still at the very start of the walk is the ground itself, subtly different underfoot, and the cumulative distance behind, which the suit's instruments record with a precision the body cannot match on its own. The confirmation, when it comes from the instrument, not from the senses. And that fact alone says something about how far this world sits from anything human perception evolved to interpret. What the traveler is learning, step by step, without any single revelatory moment to mark the learning, is that this planet does not announce its transitions. It accumulates them. The difference between the ground at the start of this walk and the ground somewhere in the middle of it is not something that could be seen in a single photograph taken at either point. It only becomes visible in the comparison, in the record of one boot placed after another across a distance that has no signpost, no marker, no way of confirming where here stood in relation to where there will eventually stand, except by the simple, unglamorous act of continuing to walk and letting the ground keep talking. The stain appears on a rock face, perhaps 30 meters off the direct line of travel, dark against the rust-colored stone around it, roughly the shape of a hand with the fingers spread. The immediate reaction, the one the mind produces before it has any evidence to justify it, is that this looks organic. A stain like this on Earth, on a canyon wall in a dry climate, would usually mean water, and water on Earth means the possibility of something living in it, or having lived in it once. That association arrives instantly, and it arrives uninvited, because it is not built from anything this world has actually shown. It is built from Earth. Consider what the stain could be without any biology involved at all. Mineral deposits leached out of the rock by whatever moisture does exist here, iron compounds oxidizing at a different rate than the surrounding stone, could produce exactly this kind of dark patterning with no organism required anywhere in the process. A transient frost, condensing during some phase of this world's slow thermal rhythm and evaporating unevenly, could leave the same kind of stain and be gone again before any repeat visit could confirm it. Even shadow, cast by an overhang invisible from this angle, interacting with a rock face, whose true color the traveler has not yet learned to read correctly under red light, could produce something the eye reports as a stain, when the camera, checked later, might report as nothing but ordinary stone. There is no way to resolve this now. That has to be said plainly, because the temptation is to keep walking closer, to touch it, to imagine that closer inspection will settle the question, and sometimes it will, but sometimes it will not, and the traveler has to hold both possibilities at once, without letting the more exciting one quietly win by default. A sample could be taken. It could be analyzed, eventually, by instruments built for exactly this purpose. But analysis takes time. This single walk does not have. And even a conclusive laboratory result would only answer the question for this one stain, on this one rock, leaving every other patch of discoloration on this planet exactly as ambiguous as it was before. A little farther on, past a rise the traveler has to climb rather than walk around, a second anomaly appears, and it compounds the problem rather than resolving it. Scattered across a shallow depression in the ground are dozens of small, roughly circular depressions of their own, spaced with an irregularity that is neither obviously random nor obviously patterned. The mind reaches immediately for two competing explanations, and cannot easily choose between them. One is geological, gas escaping from beneath a cooling surface, or some process of differential erosion acting on a rock layer with pockets of varying hardness, could produce circular pits of roughly this size, with no organizing intelligence behind their placement at all. The other explanation is the one the mind does not want to say out loud, because saying it changes the entire nature of this walk, and that is the possibility that something laid these markings down deliberately, or that something living once occupied each of these small hollows, the way a colony of burrowing organisms on Earth might occupy a comparable landscape. The honest position is that neither explanation can currently be ruled out, and the honest position is also the most uncomfortable one to hold, because it means the traveler has to keep walking past a discovery that might be the most important thing a human being has ever found, and might, with equal plausibility, be nothing at all. There is a version of this moment that a person could tell later as a story with a clean answer already in it, the depressions confirmed as one thing or the other, but that version does not exist yet. What exists is the depression itself, unexplained, and a traveler whose only honest option is to record it as precisely as possible and move on without resolving it, because resolving it prematurely would mean lying about what the evidence actually supports. This is the shape every future encounter on this walk is going to take, and it is worth naming clearly before it happens again and again. Something appears. An interpretation suggests itself immediately, usually the most dramatic available interpretation, because the mind is not a neutral instrument, and it is primed, after a journey this improbable, to want the discovery to matter as much as possible. Then, if the traveler is being careful, a set of reasons surfaces for why that interpretation could be wrong, sometimes several reasons, sometimes reasons strong enough to make the exciting explanation feel almost embarrassing in retrospect. And then, almost always, no way exists in the moment to adjudicate between them. The stain might be biology. It is more likely mineral. The depressions might be burrows. They are more likely erosion, though even that word, erosion, describes a process this world's slow, static light regime makes stranger and less understood than erosion on a planet with normal weather. What makes this genuinely difficult, rather than simply a matter of managing expectations, is that the tools available to this traveler were not built to eliminate ambiguity in real time. They were built to record it faithfully, so that people with more time, more equipment, and the ability to compare this walk against thousands of others could eventually judge what the traveler alone, standing here now, cannot judge. That is not a failure of the mission. It is the entire design of it. A single body, walking across a single, unfamiliar world, was never going to resolve every mystery it passed. It was only ever going to notice them accurately enough that the noticing itself would be worth the distance it took to get here. There is a version of caution here that would be its own kind of mistake, and it is worth naming too. A traveler who refused to entertain the exciting interpretation at all, who dismissed the stain as certainly mineral and the depressions as certainly erosion simply to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty, would be committing an error just as serious as the one who declared them biological without evidence. The discipline required is not skepticism toward the dramatic explanation specifically. It is equal skepticism toward every explanation, dramatic or mundane, until something distinguishes one from the rest. Confidence itself, in either direction, is the thing to be suspicious of out here, because confidence is cheap and evidence is not. Later, much later, after this walk has ended and its recordings have crossed the distance separating this planet from the people waiting to interpret them, both the stain and the depressions will very likely become exactly what they are right now, individual data points inside a much larger argument among specialists who were never present for the walk itself and who will have only images, spectra, and a traveler's careful notes to work from. Some of those specialists will lean toward the mineral explanation. Others will lean toward biology or toward something stranger than either, a process this world produces that has no clean analog on Earth at all. The argument may run for years without resolving, the way arguments about ambiguous evidence from Earth's own history have sometimes run for decades before a single new observation finally tipped the balance, if one ever did. The stain stays behind, unresolved, a hand-shaped mark on red stone that may mean everything or nothing. The depressions stay behind too, an ordered irregularity the traveler cannot yet call ordered or irregular with any confidence. Both are recorded, neither is explained, and the walk continues, carrying two new unanswered questions forward into a landscape that, judging by everything encountered so far, is not going to run out of them. Somewhere past the halfway point of this walk, the traveler notices something has gone wrong, not with the planet, but with the body carrying it forward, and the wrongness is harder to name than a stain on a rock or a field of unexplained depressions, because it is happening on the inside. Every human body runs on a clock it did not choose and cannot switch off, a roughly 24-hour rhythm built into cells long before any human ever needed to think about circadian biology as a subject with a name. That clock evolved around a world where light and dark alternate with total reliability, and it depends on that alternation the way a plant depends on soil. Take the alternation away, and the clock does not stop. It drifts. Without the sun's rise and fall to reset it each day, the body's internal rhythm begins running slightly long or slightly short of 24 hours. And over the course of even a single uninterrupted stretch like this one, that small daily error compounds into something the traveler can feel directly, an appetite that arrives at what the body insists is dinner, while the light outside insists nothing has changed since morning. Sleep becomes the clearest casualty. On Earth, the hormone that signals the body toward rest is suppressed by daylight and released as darkness falls, an ancient chemical handshake between a nervous system and a planet's rotation. Here, that handshake has nothing to respond to. The light is not falling. It has not fallen in hours, and will not fall in the way the body expects for many hours more. The traveler grows tired anyway, because exhaustion from exertion does not require darkness to arrive. But the tiredness feels wrong, disconnected from any signal the body recognizes as legitimate, a fatigue with no evening attached to it to make sense of the timing. Balance turns out to depend on more than the inner ear. It depends, subtly, on a visual horizon that behaves the way horizons are supposed to behave, and on a light source whose position provides an unconscious reference for which way is which. Astronauts training for missions in environments with unfamiliar gravity have long reported disorientation that has less to do with the mechanics of balance and more to do with the loss of these small ambient cues. And something similar begins asserting itself here, a misstep on uneven ground, one that on Earth the body would have corrected before the conscious mind ever registered it as a stumble, takes a fraction of a second longer to catch, because part of the automatic correction machinery is calibrated to a sky that is not behaving as expected. The eyes themselves are adapting in ways that will take time to reverse, assuming they are ever asked to reverse. Under a sun cooler and redder than the one they evolved to see by, and under a light level that never brightens the way daylight normally would, the visual system has been slowly shifting its sensitivity, the pupils staying wider than they would under equivalent brightness on Earth, the perception of color quietly recalibrating so that a shade of red that would have looked alarming an hour into this walk now reads as simply ordinary. This is not a malfunction. It is the visual system doing exactly what it is built to do, adjusting to its environment. But it means the traveler's own sense of what counts as a strange color, a strange brightness, a strange shadow, is not fixed. It is sliding, quietly, underneath every observation being made, which means some of what felt anomalous earlier in the walk may simply have been the eyes still calibrated to Earth, and some of what will feel unremarkable an hour from now may in fact be strange enough to matter, if only the eyes had not already adjusted past the point of noticing. There is a psychological dependency here too, one harder to measure than pupil width or sleep hormone levels, and it has to do with clocks in the more literal sense. A person on Earth rarely has to consciously track the passage of time because the environment tracks it for them, constantly, in the changing angle of light alone. Strip that away, and the mind reaches for substitutes, checking the suit's chronometer more often than strictly necessary. Not because the information is urgently needed, but because the absence of any ambient sense of duration creates a kind of quiet anxiety that checking the numbers partially soothes. The traveler notices this reaching, notices the hand moving toward the wrist display more often than the walk requires, and recognizes it for what it is, a nervous system built across hundreds of millions of years of a spinning, cycling planet, trying and failing to find its footing on one that offers no such rhythm at all. None of this is dangerous. Not yet. Not on a walk of this length. But it is worth sitting with, because it reframes what discovery actually means out here. The planet is not only alien in its geology and its light, it is alien in what it does to the instrument doing the observing. A body that cannot trust its own sense of elapsed time, its own read of color, its own automatic balance, has to work harder to trust its own conclusions about everything else it is seeing, the stain on the rock, the depressions in the ground, the faint wind beginning to build. Every observation from this point forward carries an asterisk that did not exist at the start of the walk, recorded by a body that is, in ways both measurable and not yet measurable, no longer entirely the same instrument it was when it stepped onto this world. Appetite drifts along its own uncoupled schedule. Hunger, like sleep, is partly governed by anticipated timing. The stomach and its attendant hormones, expecting food at intervals the mind has learned across a lifetime of mornings, afternoons, and evenings that arrived on schedule. Here, those intervals have nothing external to anchor themselves to, and the traveler finds hunger arriving early, then late, then not at all when it should. Each mistimed signal a small additional reminder that the body's internal calendar and the planet's actual state have quietly stopped agreeing with each other. This is the quieter half of what it means to visit a genuinely alien place. It is not only that the ground looks strange or the sky refuses to move. It is that the traveler carrying the only working set of human senses on this entire planet is, hour by hour, becoming a slightly less reliable narrator of what those senses report. And there is no way to pause the walk long enough to let the body recalibrate, because recalibration was never going to happen here. It was only ever going to happen 4 light-years away, on a world this body was built for, long after this walk has become nothing more than a recording other people study. The traveler hears the change before seeing it, and that fact alone says something worth pausing on, because sight has been the dominant sense for this entire walk, the sense every instrument and every decision has been organized around. Now, without warning, hearing takes over, and it does so because the wind has stopped being a background detail and has become the loudest thing on this planet. Sound behaves differently depending on what a planet's atmosphere is actually made of and how dense it is. And this world's atmosphere, if it has retained a substantial one at all, remains one of the least understood variables in the entire walk. A thicker atmosphere carries sound farther and more richly than a thin one, the way a shout underwater travels differently than a shout in open air. If this world's air sits closer to Earth's density than to Mars's thin remnant, every footstep, every breath, cycling through the suit's recyclers, every gust, crossing the open ground ahead, should carry with a fullness that a thinner world could never produce. If the air is thinner than expected, the same events would sound flattened, distant, oddly muted, even at close range, the way sound behaves at high altitude on Earth, where the air itself has less substance to carry a vibration through. The wind, whatever its density is doing to it, has clearly picked up. It was a faint directional pull hours ago. Evidence, maybe, of heat being carried from the permanent day side toward the permanent night side, the way a planet locked in this configuration would need to move heat if it were going to keep its far hemisphere from freezing solid. Now it has a voice, low and continuous, rising and falling, in a pattern that does not repeat exactly the same way twice. The sound of moving air interacting with terrain the traveler cannot yet see clearly enough to explain. Underneath that steady roar, something else is audible, intermittent, sharper, closer to a crack than a rush. It could be thermal stress in rock, a common enough phenomenon anywhere temperature differences build up faster than a material can expand or contract to accommodate them, producing small fractures that release a sound not unlike a gunshot heard from a great distance. It could be particles carried on the wind itself, abrasive grains striking exposed surfaces, including the suit, at a frequency too irregular to be anything but chaotic collision rather than any kind of pattern. It could, and this possibility is harder to dismiss the longer the traveler listens, be something to do with ice, if ice exists in any meaningful quantity on this stretch of ground. fracturing under stress, the way glacial ice on Earth produces sounds sudden enough to startle people who have spent years around it and should know better than to flinch. The suit itself is not a passive listener in all this. It has its own voice now, a faint vibration transmitted through its structure as the wind strengthens, a low hum the traveler has to consciously distinguish from the environmental sound arriving through the external microphones, because the two have started to blend at certain frequencies. Distinguishing suit noise from planet noise becomes its own small, ongoing task, one more layer of interpretation required before any of this can be recorded as reliable data, rather than an artifact of the equipment doing the recording. What makes this section of the walk different from everything before it is that sound is arriving first, and explanation is arriving second, sometimes long second, sometimes not at all yet. Sight, for most of this journey, has allowed the traveler to form a hypothesis and then walk toward confirmation or contradiction of it, closing the distance between suspicion and certainty one step at a time. Sound does not offer that same negotiation. A crack heard once, from an unknown distance, in an unknown direction, does not resolve itself the way a stain on a rock resolves itself under closer inspection, because the source of the sound might already be behind the traveler, might be kilometers away, carried by wind, might have already finished happening by the time its sound arrives at all. This is, in its own way, the corona overhead, making its indirect presence known even here at ground level, though the traveler has no direct way of confirming that connection in the moment. The star above is unusually active for its size, its outer atmosphere far denser than anything the sun produces, dense enough that models of the space environment around this planet describe conditions more violent than almost anywhere else a rocky world is known to exist. None of that violence is visible yet in any dramatic way, but an atmosphere sitting under a star that behaves like this one does is not a passive, static thing. It is a system constantly absorbing energy from above and redistributing it, and the sounds the traveler is hearing now, the wind, the cracks, the low-suit hum threading through both, may be the ground-level signature of a much larger and much stranger process happening far above, one this single walk was never equipped to observe directly and can only listen to second-hand, translated into vibration, arriving at the ear before the mind has any way of explaining what produced it. There is a temptation, standing in the middle of this rising noise, to assign it meaning it may not have. A crack that sounds deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a signal, is the kind of thing a tired mind reaches for after enough hours without sleep and enough unresolved mysteries already recorded. The honest posture is the same one required for the stain and the depressions earlier in this walk. Notice the pattern, resist the urge to declare it, and let the recording speak for itself once people with more time and less exhaustion are able to study it properly. A sound that feels significant in the moment it is heard is not automatically significant, and the loneliness of listening to it without anyone else present to confirm the impression is its own kind of pressure toward premature conclusions. The wind continues to build as the walk goes on, never quite gusting, never quite settling either, a steady escalation that has no obvious ceiling yet in sight. If this is in fact the beginning of the heat transport circulation that a tidally locked world like this one would need to survive, then the strengthening the traveler is hearing now may simply be a preview, a mild version of something that grows considerably fiercer, closer to the Terminator itself, where the temperature contrast between endless day and endless night reaches its sharpest point. There is no way to confirm that from here. There is only the sound getting louder, the suit's faint hum working harder to stay distinguishable underneath it, and a landscape ahead that the ears are now describing more confidently than the eyes. The landscape ahead is still mostly obscured, the light dimmer now than at any point earlier in the walk. And for the first time since stepping onto this world, the traveler is relying on sound to tell them what is coming, before sight can confirm it. Whatever waits at the edge of visibility, it is making noise long before it becomes anything the eyes can verify. The traveler reaches the terminator, and the first thing to say about it is that the word itself is misleading, because nothing here terminates. It is the boundary between the half of Proxima b, locked in permanent day, and the half locked in permanent night, and it looks, at first glance, exactly like the most beautiful sunset anyone has ever seen. The star sits low, enormous, glowing a deep, unbroken red at the very edge of the horizon. And every instinct built by a lifetime on Earth insists this moment is temporary, that within minutes the color will deepen further and the light will finally go out. It does not. This is not a sunset approaching its end. This is a sunset that has already reached its permanent, unmoving conclusion and will remain exactly here, at exactly this angle, for as long as the planet continues turning the same face toward its star. The disorientation of that fact is different from anything encountered earlier in the walk, because it is not subtle. Everywhere else on this world, the strangeness accumulated slowly, in shadows that barely lengthened and a wind that barely strengthened. Here it arrives all at once, in a single sweeping view that the human visual system reads instantly and correctly as one of the most emotionally loaded scenes it knows, the ending of a day, and then has to immediately unlearn that reading, because no day is ending. A day was never happening here to begin with, not in the sense the body understands the word. The physical reason for this permanence traces back to measurements made from 4 light-years away, long before any traveler ever stood at this boundary to confirm them directly. Astronomers had known since 2016 that something with roughly the mass of Earth orbited this star every 11 days, but that number, repeated for years afterward, was always a minimum, a lower bound forced by the fact that the detection method used, measuring the star's wobble, cannot by itself reveal the angle at which the planet's orbit is tilted relative to an observer on Earth. More recent analysis has inferred that tilt at somewhere near 47 degrees, and if that inference holds, the planet's true mass sits roughly 40% above the figure most people have heard repeated for a decade. The world the traveler is standing on may be meaningfully more massive, with meaningfully stronger gravity than the number that made headlines when it was first announced. None of that changes what the Terminator looks like. It changes what it took to get here, and what this world's history has actually been. A planet with real mass, real gravity, real geological activity churning beneath its crust, is a very different kind of place than the bare minimum estimate the world spent years imagining. And the traveler standing at this boundary is standing on whichever version turns out to be true, whether or not anyone back home has fully absorbed the correction yet. The wind the traveler heard building for the last stretch of the walk arrives here at full strength, and its behavior finally makes sense in a way it did not before. This is very likely where the atmosphere, if there is enough of one to carry heat meaningfully at all, does its most essential work, pulling warmth from the endless day side and pushing it across the boundary into the endless night, the only mechanism available on a world like this for keeping the far hemisphere from becoming a solid, frozen waste. Standing directly in that transfer, the traveler is standing inside the planet's life support system, in the most literal sense possible, a permanent current of moving air, doing, continuously and without pause, the job that a normal rotating planet accomplishes through the simple turning of day into night, and back again. The temperature swings here faster than anywhere else on the walk. A few steps toward the day side, and the warmth returns, faint but unmistakable. A few steps toward the night side, and it drops away with a speed that has no analogue in the gradual cooling encountered earlier. Visibility shifts too, the deep red light of the low sun scattering differently through whatever atmosphere exists here than it did on the near side, producing a haze at the boundary that makes the exact edge between light and dark difficult to define with precision, even while standing directly inside it. There is a history buried in this boundary that no single glance can reveal, and it belongs to a much older chapter of this planet's existence than anything the traveler has directly observed today. Proxima Centauri, in its youth, was a far more luminous, far more violent star than it is now, still contracting toward the smaller, dimmer state it occupies today, and a planet, at this orbital distance, may have spent something like 90 to 200 million years sitting inside what was then the star's habitable zone's inner edge, or possibly closer, absorbing a dose of high-energy radiation across its lifetime that some estimates place at 8 to 25 times what Earth has received across its own history. There is a version of this world's origin story where that early violence was not the disaster it sounds like. If the planet formed with even a small envelope of hydrogen gas, perhaps a fraction of 1% of its total mass, the star's superluminous youth may have stripped that envelope away entirely, while leaving whatever water existed underneath largely intact, a process some researchers describe as leaving behind a habitable evaporated core, a planet that survived its own star's violent adolescence by sacrificing an outer layer it may never have needed in the first place. The traveler cannot see any of that history directly. What is visible is only the present result of it, a red light frozen at the horizon, a boundary of moving air and shifting temperature, ground that may have spent 100 million years or more absorbing radiation intense enough to strip a planet down to something leaner and, perhaps, more durable than it started out. Whatever this world survived to become what it is now, it survived it long before any human being existed to wonder about it. And the Terminator standing here today is simply the visible edge of an outcome decided in the deep past by forces this single walk can only stand inside, not explain. There is another version of this world's origin worth holding alongside the first, because the evidence does not yet force a choice between them. Rather than forming close to its star and surviving that early violence in place, this planet may have formed farther out, in cooler, gentler territory, and been moved inward later by gravitational interactions within the wider system, possibly during a close passage of Proxima itself near the two brighter stars, Alpha Centauri A and B, that it orbits at a great distance across a period of roughly 550,000 years. If that version is closer to the truth, the ground beneath this traveler's boots did not survive its star's youth so much as arrive after the worst of it had already passed, migrating into a boundary that only later hardened into the shape it holds today. Both stories are consistent with what little is currently known. Neither can yet be ruled out standing here at the Terminator with only one walk's worth of observation to go on. What both versions share is the same conclusion about how little of this planet's deep past can be read directly off its surface. The Terminator itself carries no label explaining which history produced it. It simply exists, the visible present tense result of one process or another, or perhaps some combination neither model captures cleanly. And the traveler standing inside that moving current of air is standing inside an outcome without being able to read the reasoning that produced it, the way a person can stand in a finished building without being able to see the decisions that shaped its architecture. The light continues to catch dust and haze differently the longer the traveler remains here, the boundary between visible day and true night refusing to hold still even though the star producing it does not move at all. A shift in wind carries a fine particulate across the line, momentarily brightening the haze on the night side with scattered red light before the particulate settles again, and for a few seconds, the darkness beyond the terminator looks less absolute than it did a moment before, an effect entirely explainable by ordinary atmospheric scattering, and yet, in the moment, difficult not to read as something closer to a signal. The star continues to burn at the same fixed angle it has held since before this walk began, and will hold long after it ends. It is not setting. It has never set. It never will. What looks, to eyes built on a spinning world, like the most poignant moment of any day, is here simply the geography of this place, permanent, unchanging, and stranger for its permanence than any actual sunset could ever be. Something changes in the sky above the terminator, and it is not the star, which continues to sit exactly where it has sat since the beginning of this walk. It is a glow, faint at first, appearing along the boundary between light and dark, almost like a second, dimmer light source, layered behind the first. The immediate guess is aurora, the kind of shimmering atmospheric light, familiar from Earth's own polar regions, produced when charged particles from a star interact with a planet's magnetic field and atmosphere at once. That guess may be correct. It also may be badly wrong, and there is no way, standing here, to tell the difference between the beginning of something beautiful and the beginning of something the suit's instruments have not been designed to survive. The star responsible for whatever is happening overhead is, by any reasonable standard, one of the most violent small stars known. It flares constantly, hundreds of times a day at the shortest wavelengths instruments have been able to track, each burst lasting only seconds, a rate far higher than anything the sun produces, and following what researchers describe as a completely different underlying pattern of behavior than solar flares do. Roughly a quarter of all the time anyone has ever spent carefully watching this star, using some of the most sensitive instruments available, it has been caught in an actively flaring state, a proportion several times higher than earlier surveys using different equipment had suggested. This is not a star that flares occasionally and otherwise behaves. This is a star for which flaring is closer to a constant condition than an event. The traveler has no way of knowing, from the ground, whether the glow building along the terminator right now is the gentle version of that activity or the beginning of something considerably worse. In 2016, an automated network of cameras built specifically to catch stellar flares in the act recorded an eruption from this star, so large it briefly raised its visible brightness by a factor of roughly 68, releasing energy on a scale roughly 10 times larger than anything previously recorded from it, a burst intense enough that, for a matter of minutes, this star would have been faintly visible to the unaided human eye from Earth, despite sitting more than 4 light-years away. 3 years later, in May of 2019, an even more extreme event was recorded, one that brightened the star by factors of over 1,000 at millimeter wavelengths and over 14,000 in far ultraviolet light, the most violent flare from this star ever directly measured, and it was over within seconds. Standing here now, watching a glow slowly intensify along the horizon, the traveler cannot rule out that this is the leading edge of exactly that kind of event, beginning at a scale too small yet to distinguish from something gentler. There is no version of caution available that resolves this uncertainty faster than the event itself will resolve it. The instruments are recording. The suit is rated for conditions well beyond ordinary daylight exposure. But rated tolerances and lived experience are different things, and the traveler standing under a brightening sky on a world this close to a star this unpredictable is, for the first time on this walk, facing a form of ambiguity that carries genuine physical stakes, rather than only intellectual ones. There is a further layer to this glow that has nothing to do with the star acting alone, and everything to do with the planet itself, potentially participating in its own star's violence. Recent analysis of years of spectroscopic observation has found that flare activity on this star appears to be statistically linked to the position of its inner planet in its orbit, occurring more often when that planet sits at particular points along its path around the star than chance alone would predict, with the possibility of pure coincidence rejected at extremely high confidence. If that link is real, it would make this system home to only the second planet ever documented to actively trigger flares on the star it orbits, a planet apparently massive enough or magnetically active enough to interact with its star's outer atmosphere in a way that provokes eruptions rather than merely enduring them. This world, the one beneath the traveler's own boots, appears to participate differently. Rather than triggering flares outright, its own orbital signal shows up in the star's light as something closer to a modulation, a subtle strengthening and weakening of certain emission lines timed to its 11-day orbit, present in light produced lower in the star's outer atmosphere, but conspicuously absent from light produced higher up, as though whatever influence this planet exerts on its star is being absorbed before it reaches the uppermost layers at all. What that means, physically, for a world this close to a star capable of provoking its own neighboring planet into inducing stellar flares, is not yet settled by anyone studying this system from 4 light-years away, and it is certainly not settled by a single traveler watching an unexplained glow brighten slowly along a fixed horizon. There is a separate strand of evidence, gathered by radio telescopes rather than optical ones, that points toward this same planet doing something no one expected a small rocky world to be capable of. Researchers analyzing observations at radio frequencies detected a signal, strongly circularly polarized, appearing at roughly half this planet's orbital period, consistent with the specific kind of emission produced when a planet's own magnetic environment interacts directly with the flow of charged particles streaming outward from its star, a process with a close analog in the way Jupiter's moon Io lights up Jupiter's own magnetosphere, through a comparable interaction. The total power involved is modest by stellar standards, something on the order of 1 trillion watts, but its mere existence would mean this world is not a passive target sitting inside its star's violence. It may be an active participant in an electromagnetic relationship with its star, generating detectable radio emission simply by existing in the orbit it occupies. None of that changes what the traveler can determine by eye, standing here, watching a glow whose ultimate cause remains genuinely unknown in the moment it is being observed. The physics behind it may be gentle. It may not be. What is certain is only that this system, star and planet together, engages in an ongoing electromagnetic conversation, more active and more strange than almost anywhere else a rocky world has been found, and the traveler standing at its most exposed boundary is, whether the glow above turns out to be beautiful or dangerous, witnessing one sentence of that conversation in real time, with no way to read the rest of it from the ground. The glow neither fades nor escalates into anything catastrophic while the traveler watches, at least not within the span of time available to keep watching it. It simply persists, uncertain, beautiful, in a way that would be easier to enjoy without the knowledge of what this star has done before, and could, without warning, do again. Somewhere in the physics producing this light is either a gentle atmospheric response to a distant, ordinary flare, or the opening moments of something the historical record says this star is fully capable of producing at a scale that would leave very little room for a human body standing exposed at the edge of a terminator to simply wait it out. The glow eventually settles, neither escalating nor entirely fading. And the traveler makes the decision that has been building since the Terminator first came into view. One more step. Forward. Past the boundary. Into the half of this planet the star's light has never touched. The change is immediate, in a way nothing else on this walk has been. The star, which sat fixed at the same angle for the entire journey to this point, drops below the horizon behind the traveler and does not reappear, will not reappear, because on this side of the planet, it never rises at all. This is not a sunset either, any more than the Terminator was one. It is simply the edge of the region this star's light reaches, crossed on foot, and on the far side of that edge, there is nothing overhead but whatever faint illumination the atmosphere itself can scatter in from the day side, and whatever residual glow the sky was showing a few moments ago, growing fainter now, with every step deeper into darkness. Temperature falls faster here than anywhere else measured on this walk, a genuine cliff, rather than the gradual slope encountered earlier between the near side and the Terminator. Without any direct starlight reaching this hemisphere at all, and without a rotation to periodically warm it, the way a normal planet's night side is warmed again by morning, whatever heat exists on the night side of Proxima b has to have arrived by transport, carried across the Terminator by the same wind the traveler heard building for the last stretch of the walk toward it. How much heat that wind actually delivers, and how far into the permanent darkness it manages to carry, is one of the central open questions about whether a world like this could sustain anything resembling stable temperatures across its far side at all, or whether the night hemisphere simply grows colder and colder the farther one travels from the Terminator, with no floor to that cooling until something else, deep geology perhaps, takes over. The ground itself changes underfoot almost immediately. What was a fused, weathered mineral surface on the day side gives way, within the first few dozen meters of true darkness, to something with a different texture entirely, harder in places, faintly slick in others, consistent with volatile compounds that would simply boil away under the endless daylight on the other side of the Terminator, but that can persist here, frozen, or nearly so, in a hemisphere that has never once seen its own star. Whether this is water ice, some other frozen compound entirely, or a mixture the traveler has no immediate way of identifying, the change is unmistakable through the boots alone, footing suddenly less certain, each step requiring a caution the near side never demanded. Sight becomes almost useless within a short distance of the Terminator's fading light. There is no true absence of illumination, not entirely. Some faint scattered glow persists longer than expected, likely light bent around the planet's curve by whatever atmosphere exists to carry it. But it is nowhere near sufficient for the kind of confident visual navigation the entire walk has depended on until now. Sound, again, becomes the dominant sense, but it has changed character from what it was at the Terminator. The wind here is colder, thinner feeling somehow, even though nothing about its actual composition has changed, and the cracking sounds that were ambiguous back at the boundary, thermal stress, or wind-driven particles, or possibly fracturing ice, are more frequent here, more insistent, consistent with a surface under greater and more sustained thermal strain than anything encountered in the light. There is a psychological shift accompanying all of this that is worth naming honestly, because it would be dishonest to describe only the physical measurements and ignore what is happening to the traveler experiencing them. The awe that characterized the Terminator, the strange beauty of a permanent sunset and an uncertain glow overhead, has curdled here into something closer to claustrophobia, despite standing in the most open, unenclosed environment imaginable. The darkness does not feel expansive. It feels close, pressing, made worse by the knowledge that whatever this hemisphere contains cannot currently be seen, only heard, only felt underfoot, and that the sense the entire walk has relied on most heavily is now the least reliable sense available. Somewhere above this hemisphere, invisible from the ground and unrelated to anything the traveler can directly perceive, this planet's relationship with its own star's outer atmosphere continues without pause. Modeling of the space environment around a world at this orbital distance suggests it experiences stellar wind pressure that can exceed 2,000 times what a comparable position near Earth would feel, with that pressure capable of swinging by factors of 10 to 100 within the span of a single day, compressing and expanding whatever magnetic bubble this planet manages to sustain around itself by a factor of 2 to 5 in the process. The planet may also drift in and out of a boundary called the Alfvén surface, the line separating conditions where the stellar wind moves slower than the planet's own magnetic signals can propagate outward from conditions where the wind outruns them entirely, with the crossing between those two very different regimes possibly happening in as little as a single day. None of that is visible from the ground. It has no sound, no light, no texture a boot could register. But it means the darkness the traveler is currently walking through belongs to a planet whose entire magnetic envelope is being squeezed and released, on a rhythm far faster than anything the traveler's own body has adjusted to across this walk. An invisible weather system, layered on top of the visible one, indifferent to whether anyone is present on the surface below to be affected by it or not. The star's absence here is total in a way its presence on the near side never was. There, at least, the sky offered something constant to orient against, however strange its stillness felt. Here there is nothing overhead to orient against at all, only a faint, diffuse glow of uncertain origin, fading with every step deeper into the hemisphere, and a growing awareness that the traveler is now standing somewhere no light from this planet's own star has ever reached. Not once, not for as long as this world has existed in its current locked configuration. Whatever this darkness holds, it holds it permanently, in a silence broken only by wind and the occasional crack of something giving way beneath a cold, too total for the day side to have ever produced. Deep into the permanent dark, the traveler sees motion. Not certain motion, not the kind that repeats itself obligingly for a second confirming look, but a shift at the edge of what the suit's low-light imaging can resolve, a patch of the ground that seems, for a moment, less dark than the ground around it, brightening faintly and then fading again before the eye can be sure it was ever really there at all. The instinct, standing alone in the dark on a planet no human has ever walked before, is immediate and almost impossible to resist. Something is alive down there, and it just moved. That instinct deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, because dismissing it out of excessive caution would be its own kind of error. But it also deserves the same scrutiny every other ambiguous signal on this walk has received, and this planet's own recent scientific history offers a sharp lesson in exactly how badly that kind of scrutiny can be needed. In 2017, astronomers announced they had detected faint structures around this very star, consistent with belts of dust, something like the asteroid and Kuiper belts that ring our own solar system, based on millimeter wavelength observations that seem to show a steady, persistent glow. It was an exciting result, treated as evidence of a more complex planetary system than anyone had previously confirmed here. Years later, a careful reanalysis of the same data found that almost the entire signal had come from a single flaring event captured during a brief window of the observing run. A burst so intense it peaked at roughly 1,000 times the star's quiet brightness at that wavelength, averaged out across many hours of otherwise unremarkable data until it looked, in the final processed image, exactly like a faint, steady structure that had been there all along. There were no dust belts. There was one flare, badly averaged, wearing the disguise of something permanent. That history matters enormously right now, standing in genuine darkness, watching a patch of ground that may or may not have just brightened. A transient event, caught at the wrong moment and interpreted without the benefit of a second look, can look exactly like a stable, ongoing phenomenon, and the only way anyone ever caught the dust belt mistake was by going back to data gathered over many more hours than the single moment that first seemed so convincing. The traveler standing here has exactly one moment. There is no larger data set to check this observation against. No years later reanalysis available in real time. No way to confirm whether what was just seen was a brief, real event, or an artifact of tired eyes and imaging hardware straining at the very edge of its sensitivity. The temptation to declare biology here is stronger than it was for the stain or the depressions encountered back on the day side, precisely because darkness makes every possibility feel more plausible. Bioluminescence exists on Earth, in organisms that have evolved it independently many times over, in environments ranging from deep ocean trenches to certain fungi in the darkest parts of forests. There is no principled reason it could not exist here as well, if life exists here at all, and a permanently dark hemisphere is exactly the kind of environment where an organism relying on generated light rather than reflected light might have some advantage. But wanting an explanation to be true, and even having a defensible reason it could plausibly be true, is not the same as having evidence that it is true. And this walk has already demonstrated, more than once, how easily an intuitive first read collapses under closer examination. This system's planetary architecture itself remains unsettled in ways that compound the uncertainty of everything the traveler is trying to interpret. A second, more distant planet in this system, once reported as a plausible super-Earth on a long, nearly 2,000-day orbit, could not be recovered when the original data were later reprocessed using improved methods, and more recent, more sensitive observations have ruled it out entirely. What was once described confidently as a three-planet system has quietly become a system whose full membership nobody currently claims to know with certainty. There may, instead, be an additional, much smaller world lurking closer to the star than any confirmed planet here, less massive than Mars, if it exists at all, inferred only from a subtle irregularity in the timing of other signals, rather than from any direct detection. A system this poorly mapped, this recently revised, is not a reassuring backdrop against which to interpret a single ambiguous brightening in the dark. There is a detail from that same Dust Belt episode worth sitting with, because it captures exactly how thin the line can be between a discovery and a mistake in this field. The astronomer who led the paper that proposed the dust belts shares nearly the same name as the astronomer who led the team that first confirmed a planet orbiting this star at all. Two different people, two different results, one correct and enduring, and one built on a single misread flare, and the second astronomer even appears as a co-author on the paper that later turned out to be wrong. Careful, credentialed people, working with real data and real expertise, produced a confident announcement that did not survive contact with more complete observations. That is not a story about carelessness. It is a story about how easy it is, even for the people who know this system best, to mistake a brief, loud event for a quiet, permanent one. And the traveler standing here has access to only a fraction of the caution those researchers eventually applied. The imaging system keeps recording, regardless of what conclusion the traveler is inclined to draw, sweeping the same stretch of ground again and again, building up exactly the kind of longer baseline that revealed the dust belt mistake for what it was, except compressed now into minutes rather than years. No second brightening appears anywhere in that record. The ground remains dark, uniformly, in every subsequent pass, and the absence of a repeat is itself a piece of evidence, though a frustratingly incomplete one, since a single non-repeating event is consistent with almost anything. An artifact that never happens twice, a rare natural process that will not recur on any timescale this walk can wait for, or genuinely something alive that has, for whatever reason of its own, gone still. The patch of ground does not brighten again. The traveller watches it for as long as patience and dwindling reserves allow, and it remains exactly as dark, exactly as inert, as everything around it. Whether that stillness means the earlier brightening was nothing, an instrument artifact, or a trick of adapting eyes, or whether it means something down there simply chose, or happened, not to do it again, in view of an observer who will not remain long enough to find out, is a question this walk cannot answer. It can only be recorded honestly as what it was. One uncertain moment of light in a hemisphere that has never seen its own star, witnessed once, confirmed by nothing, and carried forward, unresolved, like everything else this planet has offered so far. Here the walk ends, not because the traveller chooses to stop, but because the story itself has to change shape. Everything up to this point has been recorded by one body, moving through one continuous stretch of time, encountering the stain and the depressions and the glow and the brightening patch of darkness in whatever order the ground presented them. That entire record now has to leave. And the moment it leaves is the moment the traveller's own part in this story effectively ends, because what happens next belongs to the people waiting 4 light-years away, and to the years it will take for anything recorded here to reach them. The distance itself is the whole problem, and it is worth stating in terms the body can actually feel, rather than as an abstract figure. Light takes a little over 4 years to cross the gap between this star and the sun, which means every image, every sound file, every measurement of temperature and wind and radio emission gathered across this entire walk is already, from the moment it is captured, 4 years out of date by the time anyone on Earth can look at it. There is no way to shorten that delay. There is no faster channel, no clever trick of physics available to any technology currently imaginable that collapses 4 light-years into anything less than 4 years of travel time for information moving at the fastest speed the universe permits. Consider what a return mission, built around very small, very fast probes, would actually face if humanity ever attempts to visit this system directly, rather than sending only the kind of data this walk represents. Recent proposals for swarms of gram-scale sailcraft, accelerated to a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, and then released to coast the rest of the way, suggest that useful imaging resolution, sharp enough to make out real surface detail, is achievable in principle. But the encounter itself would be brutally brief, the high-speed flyby lasting under a minute before the probes are gone, carried onward by their own momentum, with no way to slow down and no way to return. And even in that single frantic minute, the data problem is worse than the speed problem. Cameras capable of imaging at rates up to 1 million frames per second would gather, in that 1 minute, vastly more information than could ever be transmitted back to Earth, even given years to do the transmitting. Almost everything captured would simply be lost, discarded by necessity, because there is no bandwidth in the universe wide enough to send it all home. A different proposal imagines slowing a sail down instead of flying past at full speed, using the light pressure and gravity of the 2 brighter stars in this system to break into an actual stable orbit, rather than a fleeting pass. The numbers involved are almost impossible to hold in the mind at a human timescale. Something like 95 years just to decelerate into the wider system, and another 46 years beyond that to finally reach this specific star and this specific planet. A mission launched by people alive today, using this approach, would arrive in a solar system that has replaced most of its own population in the meantime, delivering its first real images to descendants of the people who first proposed sending it, not to anyone who remembers the launch itself. This walk, then, this single, continuous experience the traveler has just completed, is not really a beginning in the way it felt like one at the start. It is closer to a message being sealed into a bottle and set adrift across a gap wide enough that whoever eventually opens it will be reading about a moment that, by the time they receive it, sits years in their own past. The stain on the rock, the unexplained depressions, the glow at the terminator, the patch of ground that may or may not have briefly brightened in the permanent dark, all of it is about to become historical the instant it starts crossing that distance, even though for the traveler who witnessed it, every one of those moments just happened. There is a strange comfort available in this, if the traveler chooses to look for it, and a strange loneliness sitting right alongside that comfort without cancelling it out. The comfort is that nothing observed here has to be resolved immediately, that the honest uncertainty this walk has maintained at every step, refusing to declare the stain biological or mineral, refusing to declare the depressions, burrows or erosion, refusing to declare the brightening patch alive or artifact, was never a failure of nerve. It was the correct response to conditions that genuinely do not permit a faster answer, and the 4-year delay guarantees that no one back home is going to demand a snap judgment either, because a snap judgment is physically impossible to deliver any faster than the light carrying it can travel. The loneliness is that the traveler will never personally know how any of it turns out. Whatever consensus eventually forms, whatever argument among specialists eventually settles, if it ever does settle, it settles on a timescale this single walk cannot wait for, and this single body cannot be present to witness the resolution of, even in principle. The person who saw the stain, who heard the cracking sounds building toward the terminator, who watched the patch of ground brighten once and never again, is not the person who will read the eventual verdict, because that verdict, if it comes at all, arrives on the other side of a gap this walk was never built to cross twice. What waits on the other end of that 4-year gap is not a single verdict, but an argument, because the traveler's own conclusions, tentative and honestly incomplete, as they were meant to be at every step of this walk, will not be the last word on any of it. Scientists on Earth, receiving this record years after it was made, will study each ambiguous observation with tools and time this walk never had, and they will very likely disagree with each other about most of it, the way researchers already disagree about whether this planet even retains the atmosphere its wind seemed to suggest, or whether its escaping gases shield themselves in ways that could preserve more of that atmosphere than the raw physics alone would predict. There is no way to ask the planet a follow-up question from that distance. There is no way to walk back to the exact patch of ground where the brightening occurred and check it again. Whatever this record contains when it finally arrives, it will have to be enough, because it is, for the foreseeable future, the only record anyone is going to get. What Earth eventually receives, years after any of this happened, is not Proxima b. It is a reconstruction of Proxima b, assembled out of fragments, the way a person might reassemble a shattered photograph, from pieces scattered across a floor. Most of the pieces present, some of them missing entirely, and a few of them ambiguous enough that 2 different people could place them in 2 different positions, and both arrangements would look almost equally plausible. Spectra, showing what the atmosphere, if there is one, might be made of. Images of the Terminator's permanent red light. A record of wind that seemed to strengthen with distance from the near side, consistent with heat being carried across the planet, the only way a tidally locked world can carry it. A radio signal that might mean this world generates its own magnetic field, in a manner reminiscent of the way Jupiter's moon lights up its parent planet's magnetosphere. A single ambiguous brightening in the permanent dark, never repeated, never confirmed, never disproven either. Consider what it would mean to hold all of that at once, without the comfort of a clean answer at the center of it. Reaching the nearest star system to our own, walking across the nearest world outside our solar system that might resemble a place life could exist, was supposed to be the moment humanity finally got a real answer to a question that has weighted the entire span of recorded history. What arrives instead is something closer to a much better set of questions, more precise, more informed, but no less open than the ones that sent a single traveler walking toward a Terminator that never actually terminates. That should not, on reflection, come as a surprise. Every step of this walk resisted resolution the same way. A stain that could be mineral or could be biology. Depressions that could be erosion or could be burrows. A dust belt discovery from years earlier that turned out to be a single misread flare, uncovered only by researchers willing to go back and check their own excitement against a longer, more patient dataset than the first exciting glance allowed. A planet that may have survived its star's violent youth intact, or may have arrived here only after that youth had already passed, with no way yet to say which. If the pattern held everywhere else on this world, there was never a strong reason to expect it would break at the very end, delivering a single unambiguous verdict just because the traveler had finally reached the far side of the boundary and come back. We do not know whether anything is alive on Proxima b. We do not know whether the brightening in the dark was a living thing or an instrument straining at the edge of its sensitivity. We do not know, with full confidence, even the planet's true mass, its full history, or the complete membership of the system it belongs to, since one long-claimed neighboring world has already been quietly erased from the record, and another, smaller one, may or may not exist just inside it. What we do know is narrower and, in its way, more valuable. Exactly how a world like this behaves under a star like this, moment by moment, measured honestly rather than assumed, and exactly how much work remains before anyone can speak about it with real certainty. Before this last part, one small thing. If this walk across the strangest world any human has ever reached held your attention this long, a like, a comment about which of these mysteries you think will resolve first, or a subscription to be here when more of this record gets read, would mean a great deal. Thank you for staying this far into the dark with me. Think of the whole record, finally, the way a single sealed message is thought of after it has crossed an ocean no ship can cross twice. It leaves one shore, carrying everything the traveler could gather in the time available, honest about what it does not know, careful not to claim more than the evidence supports, and it drifts for years, through a silence, with no shortcut through it. What it delivers, when it finally arrives, is not a shoreline finally reached. It is a better map of the water still ahead. That water does not care whether we ever finish charting it. Proxima b will keep turning the same face to its star long after every person who worked on this mission has died, indifferent to whether the questions raised here ever receive complete answers, indifferent to whether anyone ever returns to check the ground where something may or may not have briefly glowed in the permanent dark. That indifference is not the end of the story. It is the reason the story is ours to finish, if we choose to, on our own schedule, using our own patience, because nothing about this planet is going to hand us a conclusion for free. There is one more piece of this reconstruction worth holding, because it reframes what a positive answer might even look like, if one ever comes. If anything like life ever did take hold on a world orbiting a star this dim and this red, it would very likely not look for a chance to be recognized the way Earth's own life advertises itself. The pigment plants use here to capture visible light sits at a wavelength convenient for a star like the Sun. Around a cooler, redder star, the equivalent adaptation would likely shift toward the edge of what a human eye can register at all, and infrared light of that kind barely penetrates more than a meter into open water, meaning even life adapted to this star's spectrum would still be functionally confined to visible wavelengths if it lived in an ocean rather than on exposed ground. Worse, the same relentless particle bombardment driving so much of this planet's strangeness would likely alter its atmospheric chemistry in ways that erase the familiar signatures Earth-trained instruments are built to look for, replacing ozone with entirely different absorbing compounds, and leaving a checklist built from Earth's own biosignatures essentially useless here. A living Proxima b, if it exists at all, might not confirm itself the way any current search expects confirmation to arrive. That possibility does not diminish this reconstruction. It sharpens what it is actually for. The record this traveler carried home was never going to be the kind of clean proof a documentary narrator promises in advance. It was always going to be raw material, honestly gathered, for people willing to keep asking better questions long after the excitement of a single walk has faded into years of careful, unglamorous analysis. The message keeps drifting. Somewhere behind it, a boundary between endless day and endless night sits exactly where it has always sat, lit by a star that never moves, holding whatever it is still holding, unwatched now, unrecorded, simply there,